I've been thinking a good bit about you're quite adamant, I want to say, early on when you were like, everyone told me I should read Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, and I did not see myself in this. Like, I did not see this about my experience of grief. And in fact, like you've said this in writing, and then you've also said it in emails. You're like, this is about heartbreak. It's not about loss. It's not about mourning. And so, especially after you sent us that Jacqueline Rose piece to read together, it sent me down a little rabbit hole to one of Patrick's favorite Freud essays, which is the one that Rose quotes from 1917 on transience. Have you ever had a chance to look at that?
No, and this is just sending me down so many rabbit holes here, you guys.
Well, the good news, unlike most of the reading we assign to people, like whether or not we have the authority to assign them reading or not, is this is only 3 pages long.
Yeah, barely.
So I'll send you a PDF. I'll link it in the show notes. Do you want to hear a little bit? Because I actually think it vibes so much more.
Amazing.
With your book. Okay, so here's Freud. I'm going to start at the beginning where it's all like bucolic and whatnot, and then and then spoiler, it's going to get less so. Not long ago, I went on a summer walk through a smiling countryside in the company of a taciturn friend and of a young but already famous poet. The poet admired the beauty of the scene around us, but felt no joy in it. He was disturbed by the thought that all this beauty was fated to extinction, that it would vanish when winter came, like all human beauty and all the beauty and splendor that men have created or may create. All that he would otherwise have loved and admired seemed to him to be shorn of its worth by the transience which was its doom. And then we get like a whole interlude where Freud is like, and this is why that poet was wrong. Of course. So we get a little bit of an argument then of something that's similar to Mourning and Melancholia, right? This is around the same time period. We'll rehearse this for everybody else. But humor me if you will. It's a long passage, but I think it's worth it. My conversation with the poet took place in the summer before the war. A year later, the war broke out and robbed the world of its beauties. It destroyed not only the beauty of the countrysides through which it passed and the works of art which it met with on its path, but it also shattered our pride in the achievements of our civilization, our admiration for many philosophers and artists, and our hopes of a final triumph over the differences between nations and races. It tarnished the lofty impartiality of our science. It revealed our instincts in all their nakedness and let loose the evil spirits within us, which we thought had been tamed forever by centuries of continuous education by the noblest minds. It made our country small again and made the rest of the world far remote. It robbed us of very much that we had loved and showed us how ephemeral were many things that we had regarded as changeless. We cannot be surprised that our libido, thus bereft of so many of its objects, has clung with all the greater intensity to what is left to us, that our love of our country, our affection for those nearest us, and our pride in what is common to us have suddenly grown stronger. But have those other possessions, which we have now lost, really ceased to have any worth for us because they have proved so perishable and so unresistant? To many of us, this seems to be so, but once more wrongly, in my view. I believe that those who think thus and seem ready to make a permanent renunciation because what was precious has proved not to be lasting are simply in a state of mourning for what is lost. Mourning, as we know, however painful it may be, comes to a spontaneous end. When it has renounced everything that has been lost, then it has consumed itself, and our libido is once more free, insofar as we are still young and active, to replace the lost objects by fresh ones equally or still more precious. It is to be hoped that the same will be true of the losses caused by this war. When once the mourning is over, it will be found that our high opinion of the riches of civilization has lost nothing from our discovery of their fragility. We shall build up again all that war has destroyed, and perhaps on firmer ground and more lastingly than before. Close quote. Now, of course, this is not identical with the argument that you make here, but I thought it resonated so much with grief is rupture, grief is futurity, this idea that you conjure, I think, really really beautifully, really movingly of the way in which like mourning creates something that you cannot possibly understand until you're in it, but it also creates visions of futurity that you couldn't have begun to access without that mourning. So I thought maybe a little bit of Freud.
Hey, Uncle Siggy is fine, but I think the thing that always stands out for me is this insistence that mourning ends,
Yeah.
right? That there and that one will replace the thing that you were mourning, and like I'm not going to replace my dad.
Right.
No, like I might replace a partner if I break up with somebody and I'm going to, end up with somebody else. But that doesn't really mean that I've replaced them in the same way.
Right.
And this is where my sort of insistence on like that like he misses the transformative nature of it. That like if we can say that grief has ended at any point, which I kind of don't think we can, you're not the same person at the other end, and you're not just sort of finding a new person to slot into the hole in your life. You are changed by that.
Yeah.
You are a different person than you were before, because you have lost this thing, whatever it was, whether it's, this object, as Freud would say.
Right.
And we just don't replace it in the same way. And I think that I bow to Jacqueline Rose, who knows a lot more about psychoanalysis than I do. And both of you know a lot more about psychoanalysis than I do. But it seems a sort of un-Freudian insistence from Freud that this thing can sort of have a concrete like shape.
Right.
And Josh Cohen, who I spoke to for the book, who is a Freudian, he was like, grief is sort of excessive. If it isn't excessive, it isn't grief. And that the sort of insistence on the boundedness of it to me feels really wrong.
Yeah.
I actually think that there's even an additional resonance here that I see you objecting to as somebody who is, I've actually seen you wear a shirt that says I'm literally a communist. But, this whole analysis takes place in the context of what Freud calls the economics of the libido.
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
that I think is in some way what you're objecting to, where he's talking in these seemingly abstract terms about like, the decathexis from the object and the replacement. And I hear in that echoes of your life's work as a journalist saying people are not replaceable, that in some way there's some sort of, whether or not Freud means it in this way, the economic terms in which it's phrased, I think, are like anathema to you.
Yeah, very much so. And it's really interesting because I've been having this conversation a lot recently. And there is, so I do this Lefty Advice podcast, which I was going to plug eventually, but we'll just go for it now.
Yeah, Heart Reacts.
And with my friend Craig Gent, who is also a, commie journalist, writer, and has a book coming out on algorithmic management. So, we are simpatico in that way. But like, we got a letter, somebody saying like, how do you bring up a sort of difficult conversation with a partner or a close person when they're sort of struggling with their mental health and they don't have the bandwidth? And like Craig and I just basically come down really hard on the idea that bandwidth is a good metaphor.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm really capacity right now.
Yeah, exactly. So capacity. So Hannah Proctor, who I did an event with last week about her wonderful book, Burnout, which like dovetails a lot with both From the Ashes and also Work Won't Love You Back in interesting ways. She wrote a thing on her Substack today, as we're recording today, which is August, that was like called Against Capacity. And she was sort of arguing the same thing, that like, rather than there be a sort of finite, whatever amount of libido, say, if we're going to use Freud's terms, or energy, emotional, whatever the hell, right? Bandwidth, battery, capacity, that's not actually how that works. And that like, actually, and I had an experience of this a couple of weeks ago. I had a big fight with somebody that I really care about. And I woke up in the morning and texted him and was just like, that's not how I want to roll. Can we fix this? And he was like, absolutely. And we went like for a long walk and like talked everything through the next day. And like both felt like so much better, not just about the fight we'd had, but like about other crap going on in our lives.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, right. Like showing up to somebody with like vulnerability and care and like investment in this relationship, not to use again, like economic terms, like that actually created the capacity in both of us to show up better than we had the previous time. Like this is one of the goals of therapy, right? Like if you were talking about ordinary unhappiness, but we're also talking about like a good therapeutic relationship will give you tools and capacity to deal with struggles that you didn't have before. And I also just think that's true about like caring about people. And, I write this book about, my father's death, and in some ways about, the loss of this relationship that I thought was going to be forever. And now I'm 44 and single, but also like I have all of these wonderful people in my life, and that doesn't like drain me because I've controlled my life in a lot of ways and stopped dealing with a lot of garbage that I used to deal with. And that's great. But also because like spending a night out like I did last night, with a friend who I don't see that often, but I really, adore. And we had like really great conversations and we sweated over Chinese food because it's a heat wave in London right now. And I went home and just like felt great, even though we talked about some heavy stuff, because when you're coming to that conversation with that kind of care, like it creates capacity. You guys are my first official interview about this book, and I'm really happy it's you, because there are going to be probably a lot of conversations about this book that are going to suck the life out of me, and I'm going to leave feeling like exhausted and miserable. But like talking to you creates that capacity. And it's, Hannah's against capacity. I find it better than bandwidth. And so like, yeah, I am like on some level an emotional communist too. And I think that, what we give, and there's a degree of understanding of people's changing, capacity, again, and like from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Right. But like the to each according to his needs part is really important in that. Right. It's not just like, I can't do this right now, so I shut down. It's, it's a tension between those two things that I think we negotiate in order to be humans in the world and have good relationships. And like, that's why that sort of, I am at capacity right now, could you please have your nervous breakdown at a more convenient moment for me, like meme. Everybody sort of knows that that's gross, but it's hard to say why. And I feel like I'm sort of struggling with trying to get to a point of saying why. It's also why, like, one of the things I insist on so much in this book is that grief is not work.
Yeah.
Which is another thing that I'm like, poking at Freud's economic metaphors, right? It's just like, it's actually not, doesn't work that way.
Listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to introduce Sarah Jaffe, who is literally fanning herself on a Zoom right now with a very elegant fan. But for those of you who cannot see her, let me tell you a little bit more. Sarah Jaffe is a writer and reporter living in New Orleans and on the road. She is the author of Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone, Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, and the forthcoming From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire, all from Bold Type Books. And it is this forthcoming book on grief that we are mostly here to talk about today. Sarah's journalism covers the politics of power from the workplace to the streets, and her writing has been published in The Nation, The Washington Post, The Guardian, The New Republic, The New York Review of Books, and many other outlets. She's a columnist at The Progressive and a contributing writer at In These Times. She also co-hosts the podcast Heart Reacts with Craig Gent, an advice podcast for the collapse of late capitalism. I want to add one other personal note, which is that I have had the pleasure of teaching Sarah's work a number of times and bringing her to campus to meet my students. It's always just been an incredibly inspirational and generative experience for them. And I'm so delighted to get to bring her on Ordinary Unhappiness to talk about the new book. Welcome, Sarah.
It is so good to be here. Remember when I came to talk to your school about Marx, and we thought everybody was going to come for me, and then they came for Christine about Freud instead?
Yeah.
It's true.
That did happen.
Oh, that's true.
Multiple Ordinary Unhappiness guest, Christine Smallwood.
Yes, that's totally true. Okay, so many of our listeners they'll know you as a journalist, and above all, they'll know you as a labor journalist, right? You have been writing about work of all kinds, and insisting that many things that people don't necessarily consider to be labor are, in fact, labor. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of your new book, From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire, and also how you see it in relation to the two previous books, Necessary Trouble and Work Won't Love You Back?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because at first it's like she's writing about grief. What the hell? And I fully expect a certain type of Marxboro to just be like, she gone soft. But so, I mean, the origins of this book are that my father died in 2018, and it completely turned my life upside down. I left the relationship that was going on 6 years that I thought I would be in forever. I now divide my time between New Orleans, London, and wherever the hell else I happen to be. And I was already writing about most of the things that made it into this book, but I started to see things as about grief, right? So, I mean, obviously, if we think about the movement for Black lives, that is about grief. We are talking about people who have literally died. We are saying their names. We are like taking part in a practice of mourning. But, I write a lot about immigration, immigrant worker struggles. And I started thinking about how, for people who are moving, we talk a lot in the sort of global North countries that are seen as sort of net recipients of migrants about why people would come here, right? As though the US and the UK are just such wonderful, wonderful places that anybody would want to live in and not worry about getting shot or whatever. And I was like, well, why don't we ever talk about what people leave behind? Why people would choose to get up and leave Bangladesh or Iraq or Syria or Libya, I don't know, maybe because our countries have screwed those places up in the first place. Mexico, Colombia, say, right? And the most interesting one, I think, was actually thinking about work, because of course I write about work all the time. But I had done this story on the Lordstown factory closing just a little bit earlier in 2018, actually. And Dave Green, who was at the time the president of the UAW local that represented the workers at Lordstown, which is in Ohio, not that far from Youngstown. And now he's the regional director for the UAW in that area. And he sort of came in and like flopped on the couch while I was interviewing the then vice president, Tim O'Hara. And he just goes, they say there are 7 stages of grief, but we can't go through them because we're trapped in the middle because we don't know what's going on here. And that really stuck with me. And that sort of became the genesis for like, oh, right, well, what are we really talking about when we talk about deindustrialization? And I mean, the question is really different. What I'm talking about, or what somebody like Gabe Winant is talking about when we talk about deindustrialization, is really different from what Donald Trump means when he's talking about deindustrialization. But to get at like why people are sad to leave these jobs that were in some ways the opposite of the jobs that I write about in Work Won't Love You Back.
Yeah.
Because jobs that you don't expect to love. We think about coal mines shutting down, right? I write a lot about the miners' strike in Britain in this book. And like, who the hell likes going down a hole in the ground where you might die at any moment to dig up black rocks and get black lung and die? Like, people were very obviously not sort of longing to go back down the hole in the ground. So what is it?
And yet that was so striking in your book, where you're quoting a coal miner who's like, those are the best days of my life.
Yeah.
And you just remarkable.
Have to see, right? Why were they? And the same, and I know Patrick spent a lot of time talking to and writing about veterans, and it was very similar to how people react to war, right? You didn't love the thing you were doing, but you loved the guy next to you. And you knew that he had your back. Even if you didn't love him, you knew he had your back. And like the sense of clarity and the sense of order to the world then was combined with, in the case of Britain, you had nationalized coal mines. So like the wages were pretty good. The conditions were as good as they could be, consider you're still going down a hole in the ground to dig up coal. And the union was really strong and really militant. And it also built these entire sort of institutions around the mine. So you had the miners' welfare, which was like the pub, but it was also where you got married, also where you had your funeral. They paid for the soccer pitch where your kids played, I should say football because I'm in England. They played for the football pitch. Your entire world was built around this thing. And once that thing is gone, particularly in the cases of coal mines, but also in the case of someplace like Youngstown, where the steel mills closed, there's not much left in these places. And if you go there, Daphne Carr, who's an excellent journalist who moved back to Youngstown a few years ago, she jokes about being a Youngstown millionaire because she bought this massive house in Youngstown, for less than I pay in rent in New Orleans, because like, what's in Youngstown? Your money goes so much further because like, where are you going to work? What do you do? And so, this sort of destruction of these entire social worlds is something that we're not talking about when we just fixate on it being about the job. And so in that way, that one actually it dovetails really well with Work Won't Love You Back, because to figure out how to write Work Won't Love You Back in the Trump era, I had to say all right, that this sort of ghost of the industrial worker is haunting this entire debate and still is, right? How do I understand what's going on here? And why the jobs that most people do, right, are completely absent from the conversation, right? Home healthcare work is the fastest growing and I think one of the single largest jobs in the US, and nobody's talking about it. And even when Joe Biden talked about it a little bit, we still couldn't get it through Congress because Joe Manchin doesn't think it's real work, right? Joe Manchin from coal country. The way that the sort of myth of this kind of work is really, really outsized, even compared to its real role in today's world. And so what are we grieving? What are we being haunted by? These seem like really important things to bring up here. And then COVID happened. So obviously I had to write a chapter about COVID grief. And then the last chapter is about climate change. And obviously sort of climate grief and climate anxiety are hot topics these days. And I have a sort of fraught relationship with the climate discourse. So I figured I'd go play with it.
I found the sections in which you talk with industrial workers or workers in deindustrializing areas or workers who are in one way or another relating to processes of deindustrialization really both really moving and eye-opening in their own right, but also really responding to the frame of grief and of mourning that you brought to bear on it. And specifically in how they sort of represented the ways in which, well, as you've just been saying, work is not just a thing you clock in and out of. It is a world that organizes, well, how your day is structured, how you relate to things basic things like, is it light out? Is it dark out? When do I have to get up? When do I need this coffee? But also how you relate to other people in the workplace and intergenerationally to families that have worked in a given industry. And what the interviews that populate the book do, I think, in such a emotionally affecting way is they don't have, reading the book, it's impossible to suffer either the mythologization of work as sort of this thing that ipso facto always has dignity, or to sort of ventriloquize the workers as necessarily loving their jobs. And by all this, what I'm trying to get to is the way in which I think you describe how, or rather you let the workers themselves describe how work as it is something that they do as a habitual thing that then may or may not leave, but also something that has been done intergenerationally relates to how they envision the futures for their families, but also entails a completely clear-eyed relationship to the stakes of the job itself. And there was this one particular bit where you write, part of the complicated grief that industrial workers feel when the industry departs is a grief for the generations of workers whose lives were lost on the job. They remember disasters of generations earlier and disasters of personal experience. Chuck Dennison told me of watching a man next to him on an assembly line, quote, have a heart attack and die right next to me. And we stopped the line. And management came and they actually moved him so they could start the line back up. The workers wished for stable employment for their children, but they wanted it to be anywhere but down the mines or in the factories. And that really is a gut punch in its own right, but it got at the way in which and I think we'll get more into the analogies between the economic and the family and the psychic and the libidinal and versus the material later, but I couldn't help but think about how a workplace, like a family, there are things that we sort of enter into with a desire to love or at least a capacity to attach. And in some ways, the entire idea of work not loving you back is about a misrecognition. We go there looking for love and we're not going to get it.
And it keeps us from
the
conditions under which we can genuinely put love at, if not the center of our lives, at least not entirely the margins.
But it's also a misdirection and a mystification And yet also it's what we learn to love, right? And that's, I think, part of the difficulty with thinking about the family and grief too, is that, people, Freud would be the first to say, like, people are not entirely fungible in the extent to which the people who raise us loom overly large in our own self-conception and our own self-constitution. And so we can have situations where you lose somebody and you are racked by the grief of that loss, but also you have, the ambivalent, vexed, overdetermined relationship to them where you're like, oh, actually they were also cruel or they could be terrible. But it's like, in the wake of a difficult grief or a passing, you can mythologize it, you can mystify it. But the thing that can sometimes be hardest and most painful is when other people show up to mystify and mythologize, when in fact, like, what we have are situations where it's precisely because something is not loving, or precisely because something is so layered with losses and griefs, that you both mourn it, but also don't want it to continue or want something different for other people. And so that's those multiple temporalities combined with the lens you bring to bear, combined with the material that you substantiate that. I think it's really remarkable.
I think just like grief is excessive or else it's not grief, I also think grief is complicated or else it's not grief, which is why, like, complicated grief as a diagnosis is just weird to me. But anyway, this idea that, like, you can grieve something that you had a really unhealthy relationship with, right? Like, I have grieved bad breakups with somebody that I'm really glad I'm not with, but it was still a loss. And the thinking about, like, the complicated feelings of grieving the workplace. And I think it's really beautifully written about, and I sort of draw on, I already mentioned Gabe Wynett, also Ewan Gibbs, who's a Scottish labor historian who wrote about the mines in Scotland. And he really was the one who actually pointed out the way that the memorials to mining accidents really started to pop up in and around and after the miners' strike, as it was clear the industry was going away. And so they were mourning the sort of specifics of, like, this disaster, this disaster, this disaster, but also the broadness of, like, this whole thing is going. And they're a really beautiful and sort of horrifying reminder of how dangerous and deadly this industry was. And the same guy who did the tour when I went to the mining museum in Yorkshire, which, like, anybody ever is in that area, I recommend checking it out, because you actually go down, like, the old mine shaft and, like, have the experience of wandering through it. And they've got it set up so you sort of move through history in it. So you see it at first when it would have been the whole family down there, and then you get to the modern equipment that is still down there. And the tours are all led by former miners, right? And the guy is telling us, like, oh yeah, at this point when I was working down here, there was this rule that these sort of mine face spaces, when you would go into, like, a new place where they've opened up the coal face, only 9 people are allowed to be in that space. And he was like, do you guys know why? And we were like, no. And he's like, well, because if 10 people die, it's a major disaster and they have to close the mine. But if 9 people die, it's a minor disaster. And I'm like, you just sit there and you're like, imagine going to work every day with the knowledge that, like, your life has been quantified to that degree, the value of your life. And the other thing this is making me think about, of course, is Nate Holdren's wonderful book that I also quote in this, because he writes about the history of sort of workers' compensation law and the quantification of the, workplace injury, like, how much for a hand, how much for a leg, how much for a life. And this, we were talking about Freud's economic metaphors, but, like, we really live in a world where, like, your life has a price on it. And sometimes that price is real cheap. And again, I'm thinking of Patrick's work on gun violence. And I thought about having a chapter on that too in this book. And also it's just like, what, like, this, right? The gun violence is not really a discrete category in that way, but also, like, the questions of, like, how does capitalism price our value? Are really, and that comes up over and over again in the book, right? It comes up in COVID, where, like, the constant theme now is like, oh, well, only old and disabled people die of COVID, so it's totally fine to just let her rip. And it's like, my dudes, do you know how eugenic you sound? Well, yes, they do, but, at least some of them do. But, like, this understanding that, like, the system only values your life if you are making profits for it, or if they can sort of extract those profits from your body. I think about my dad in the care home, right? When he was released from the hospital, that he was sort of rehabbing in a nursing home facility, which was a terrible for-profit company that my mother wanted to sue and failed to. And it was, these poor overworked women who probably had 3 jobs, who are running around trying to take care of everyone. And you just look at that and you're like, right, like this is what happens when you're no longer working. This is where they extract value from you next. And to contrast that actually with Kevin, who is one of the former miners that I spoke to he lives in Sheffield, who became a care worker after the mines closed down. And I did not know this when I sat down to interview him. That was like a total coincidence. I was like, we had been talking for 3 hours in this cafe in Sheffield with him and Kate. And he was just like, Kate had to leave. And I was just like, so what did you do when the mines closed down? He's like, oh, I went into care. And I was like, say more, pull out a fresh, whatever, and like, go on, sir. And that kind of thing. And he was just like, yeah, like I really actually loved it. And I really got to be close with some of these men he worked with. And he was, a big guy who had been working a physical job most of his life. And so he went into specifically sort of adult care for people with mental and emotional disabilities. And it was like people who might get violent. And it's a lot more, the average person who works in home care is probably my size. For your listeners, I'm about 5'4". So having this like big dude who could like, you could train him to like physically restrain somebody without killing them. And there's actually a bit that we cut from the first chapter of the book because somebody started a genocide while I was writing, and we had to include that. But I had a section on Jordan Neely being killed on the New York City subway. And I thought about this a lot after that happened and after I had talked to Kevin, because I was like, what if the person who had tried to restrain him on the subway was somebody who was trained in care rather than in killing? How different would that have been if somebody like Kevin had been there who knew how to talk somebody down who was having a crisis and knew how to, like, if they needed to even safely physically restrain somebody who was having a crisis rather than somebody who only knew how to kill him?
I'm going to restrain myself because we just did an episode with Lauren Dent talking about psychosis in ways that are Lacanian, but in terms of clinical treatment that are directly in conversation with the draconian Adams administration policies. So I'm going to like restrain us from going down that road because I want to make sure. But I will say that I feel like you are really in conversation with a lot of that. But I want to make sure that our listeners get a sense of the scope of your book. All right, I want to make sure we have that out on the table. And so the beginning of the book outlines 5 framings of grief. Grief as rupture, grief in relation to futurity, grief as not work, grief as anathema to capitalism, and grief as collective becoming. And so this allows you to range really widely in this book and for you to think about grief really capaciously, not just in relation to the loss of a beloved person, right, to what Freud might think of as the object, but also in connection to climate change, in connection to a home, to a job, to a country. And I mean, I think perhaps most importantly, as a spur to collective organizing and to genuine structural change. Right. This is actually quite a hopeful book in many ways. So grief opens up in your telling the possibility for the remaking of a world that, thinking about Mark Fisher here, right? And the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, a world that for so much of us is marked by our inability to reimagine it. So I'm hoping you can sketch out these 5 framings for us, as well as how they help you work through the 5 major topics that we've already alluded to a bit. But just for, so we're all on the same page, Sarah has organized the book around state violence, around migration, deindustrialization, pandemic, and climate.
Yeah, you said Mark Fisher. I want to just name drop my friend Ashawn Crawley, who talks about like imagining otherwise and like otherwise thinking and otherwise being. And that it's actually, I think the last end note in the book is from his book. And I thought a lot about that because to think about grief as rupture, right? To start at the beginning, to think about it as something that sort of upends your ability to see your life the way you had done, right? And like I was not particularly close with my father. We had disagreements about politics. He voted for Trump. I thought that was outrageous, particularly for a Jew. And we had fought a lot in the time up to him getting sick. He lived in South Carolina. I would see them like once a year, maybe, him and my mother, who still lives there. But the fact that he was gone, like, just completely changed the way I thought about, not even thought, the way I like existed in the world. Because it is too much to sort of attribute it to consciousness, right? It's unconsciousness. It's bodily. It's, somatic. It's everything. It sped up my heart rate. It it physically affected me in these ways that were like terrifying. Frankly, I'm like, am I having a heart attack? Am I just gonna drop dead here too? No, I'm just like literally in panic. The thinking about rupture. And I actually, when I read China Miéville's book on the Communist Manifesto, interestingly enough, he writes really beautifully about the concept of rupture, right? The way that like revolution in this way is a break with what came before. And I also kept returning to Walter Benjamin on the sort of emergency break, right? Because I think grief is a pause, it's a stop, it's a sort of break on everything that you've been doing. And it is just like, it will shut you down. And if you don't pause, eventually your body will shut you down for you, right? And I talked to a bunch of sort of clinicians of various stripes for the book who all said basically the same thing, which is like, if you don't take care of it, your body will like come for you. And that understanding that this is in some way like a really disruptive thing that happens to you, that you cannot sort of keep going forward the way you were going before. What does that actually mean in terms of, when people's grief is politicized in these ways? And again, we were in the middle of, several rounds of movement for Black Lives uprisings when I started to conceptualize this book and thinking about it, in 2020, 2021, and saying like, oh, right, like this is what happens when you can't actually keep going, is you pour out into the streets and then you see all of these other people. And that gets me to the collective question sort of sooner than I meant to. But the fact that like both everybody sort of grieves in very horribly specific ways, and that like one of the tragedies of it is that you might be grieving the same person, but you will be grieving that in totally different ways. And like my mother and I could not connect and talk about my father's death. My sister and I have even had a hard time talking about my father's death. But at the same time, I got this outpouring from friends who had lost parents, right? Some of whom were very close, mutual friend of all of ours, Dani Rajendra, right? But also people that I barely knew who just like texted me like, welcome to the Dead Dads Club. Let me know if you need to talk. Like, this like, oh, we've sort of moved through, we've become something else in this way, felt really sort of profoundly important to me to think about the future, right? I've sort of been saying this already, like that, and this is one of my major beefs with Freud, right? Is that like Freud is kind of like, oh, it's just about like, detaching from all of these things that happened in the past. And that is sort of what I expected grieving to be like, right? I expected I would be very sad, and I expected I would have I would spend a lot of time in my memories. And that's not at all what happened. What happened instead was I would like start crying because I was never going to win this argument with my father. It was like, I couldn't imagine like doing this thing that I needed to do, which in fact was sit down and write a book proposal, which was Work, Won't Love You Back. In fact, like I was working on that book when my father died. And it completely sort of like threw a wall in front of the forward motion that I thought I was going to have. And then had to figure out an entirely different way of living. If you think about that in terms of, right, migration, a lot of people whose entire life, who you'd planned, like most people who end up moving across the world to come to another country, like didn't always intend to do that. That was not like life goals. It was like something came up, something changed, and now I'm here. She says from London, like and that's a relatively easy white woman with multiple degrees in the global north kind of movement. For people who get on the the fishing boat, the Adriana that I write about in the migration chapter that collapsed at the same, or that sunk, right, at the same time as those douchebags in their submarine were, vaporized while trying to go visit the Titanic. People on that boat didn't have that on their bucket list, right? They gave up a lot or had it taken from them before they left, right? If you're talking about people who are coming from somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan, like you might have had a good life. Like, Idris, who I interviewed, who's from Iraqi Kurdistan, who just like, he wanted to just stay there his whole life. He loved it there. He wanted to play football, and that was what he wanted to do with his life. And suddenly he is in a refugee camp in Turkey. And then his parents are saying, his mom is saying, you go on to England by yourself because you're under 18 and maybe they'll be nicer to you than they will be to us. My God, that's an amount of like grief that I can't fathom, and having to completely reimagine what your world is going to look like, right? Like literally on the other side of the world. That thinking about that seemed like, and the concepts sort of don't map immediately onto these,
right?
But it is like sort of loosely arranged that way. Yeah, and then and again, the one that's obvious to everybody is when I start talking about work because I'm me. But it's really fascinating, and people sort of still kind of can't wrap their brain around me like insisting on something not being work. But I also had this idea when my father died, not just that I would be very sad and be whatever, but that I could be good at it somehow. Yeah. That I would like process, and I would go to extra therapy, and I would talk to people, and I would get through
you
this
would ace it
faster. Right. Exactly. Which is like so my dad's kind of thinking, by the way. Thanks, Dad. My dad who like had a complete breakdown when his parents died. But anyway, in thinking about all of the things that are work and talking about like the family as a workplace and housework as work and sex work as work and all of these other things as actual work, I also started to just come to this place of like, okay, but what isn't work then? And I interviewed Namwale Serpell for Book Forum. Thank you, Dave O'Neill, who understands me. God bless editors who give us good assignments, right? And her wonderful, wonderful, wonderful novel, The Furrows, which is all about grieving. It's so beautiful.
We'll put it in the show notes.
And we were talking about Freud and how he's wrong. Spoiler alert, that comes up there too. And she mentioned this piece that someone had sent her that she ended up sending to me on the concept of drift. And it was her first novel was called The Old Drift, which is also incredible. But it was this idea of the middle voice that sort of English and modern European languages have lost this tense that exists between active and passive. So when something is drifting, it's not active, but it's not active. And I was really, really struck by this. And she said, like, I think grief is like this. And I was, yes, exactly. And to think about like, what are the things that aren't work? And I was having an argument with a friend of mine a little while ago who was sort of semi-teasing me about the things being not work. And he was like, well, I just think of like the physics description of work. And I was like, oh, bite me. But even in that space, right? Like, what is it to drift, to float, to whatever? But also, what is it to grieve? Because like, it's not like one is sitting, even if you want to accept Freud's, sort of decathexis idea, you're not sitting around consciously going like, okay, now I'm going to think of this memory of my dad and I'm going to detach from that. Like, that's not how that works. Instead, you maybe have a cry and then you maybe go for a walk and then maybe you go back to your day job and you have dinner with your partner and you put the kids to bed. And all the while in there, you are an emotional roller coaster. Kristen Urquiza, who's in my COVID chapter, says it felt like a Category 5 hurricane had been put in her body. That these things are happening at an unconscious level, at a bodily level that you can't work at, that grief on some sense does you rather than you doing grief. That it is transformative, but also not like volitional, and that seemed like, right, like the stages thing is just like everybody who actually has any experience with it grieving is just like, this is bullshit. And that like to understand things as something other than like an active process that you're in. And like, interestingly, and here is where I get like super personal, like I started to think of love this way too, right? That like in writing Work Won't Love You Back, I sort of want to reclaim love from work, right? So it makes some sense that I go here with this. But the idea that love is something you do, like in the bell hook sense of like love is a choice and love is a whatever. And like that's true, right? But also I would find myself like working so hard at like getting people to love me and getting people to like me and, just like textbook people pleasing for a long time. And then I had to realize with this person who, he shows up many times obliquely in the book, including on the last page, is somebody that I just like love very, very much. And we had for a while a very complicated relationship that at this point was like a very, very simple and kind and just like loving relationship, where we just send each other texts and voice notes that are like, I love you, I miss you, how are you? But I had to accept at some point, and I literally said to him, I was like, I'm still trying to earn your love. And you keep telling me that I already have it. And I had to accept at some point that it was there, even when we weren't in constant contact, even when we live in different countries, even when I haven't seen him in person in a year, that it's not gone because we're not doing it actively all the time. And that really did again, sort of shake up how I think about and experience all of these things, to just be like, oh, it's not work in that way. Like it is a choice on some level, but it's also kind of not like, to be like somewhat romantic. It's like, I just don't think that I could love just anyone. Whether I'm being, friendship or whatever, it's something that is unconscious and powerful in a totally different way than the things that we choose to do and choose to work at.
Maybe at that point, it could be helpful for me just to gloss sort of some of Freud's language here and the way he sort of articulates this notion of both the economic and of what sort of constitutes work. And I wanted to say this because I actually think that the account that you give is actually deeply compatible with his approach, precisely because, and this gets into what you were just saying, what Freud is trying to capture there are processes that have a degree of automaticity, right? That is, that they're not reducible to volitional, intentional operation, right? So
not in the active voice, as it were, to pick up on Sarah's previous metaphor.
And in fact, because they're happening on a level, it's not just your subjective self-present consciousness and awareness that's doing this thing, but rather you as a psyche, which has this entire other sort of half, if you want to sort of break it down in those terms, but really, it's a dynamic model in the sense that you can't really break it down that easily, is also unconscious, is also sort of working at it. So the terms I think that are sort of helpful to gloss here, right? First, there's this word of like, what is the word that we get that's mourning, right, in the English, right?
Yeah.
And that already gives us a verb and a gerund. You're doing this thing called mourning, right? Whereas in the German, it's Trauer, right? And my German pronunciation is terrible, but there that's a noun that means both. Well, it can mean grief, right? And then there are terms like the Trauers, like the period of time for mourning, et cetera. I think Yiddish has a similar expression too, where that's the activity that you perform, but also it's an affect that you feel and display. So in that way, it's also a term that can be translated as like sorrow, right? So there, it's not so much about the distinction between process and activity, and feeling is not as clear as we might have it in the English, right? So when Freud is talking about mourning, he's talking both about people going through a process which has a social dimension, but also as showing certain types of feelings or relationships to the world. And that's, when we later talk about, I imagine we'll get into this, the analogy that he draws is to explore what does this thing that he calls melancholia, which we might more probably today call like major depression, right? How does that resemble on a surface analogical level processes of grief? So the second thing I kind of wanted to gloss here is this notion of like work. And I think that this is one that's a little delicate. And again, I want to be clear that I actually think that what you propose, particularly insofar as it relates to dynamics of time, predictability, and its relationship, not just to our own intentions, but to like the intentions of management or the HMO that says you can only grieve for so long. In other words, like the demands of capitalism, it goes against that rather than being consonant with it, right? And by that I mean, just to get granular about this, the term that Freud uses that sometimes gets translated as the work of mourning, right, is Trauerarbeit. And again, my German pronunciation has faded, right? But there it's sorrow work as sort of one word. And some people have made a lot about how this is a pun. You can make a pun with this versus the Trauerspiel, which is a type of tragic drama, which actually Walter Benjamin writes
Benjamin
about.
wrote about famously.
Yeah, and that's a very bourgeois phenomena, et cetera. You know, so there's a playfulness there. And we might ask, like, well, if the opposite of work is play, what does it mean to have sad play, right? Or a sad playfulness. But the through line through Freud's work is to use variations of Arbeit, right? In the sense that he gets it from, well, actually, you know, and I hate to emphasize this aspect of the meaning of the word work, but it actually does come from a biophysics sort of tradition, it's called, or from an energistics, right? And so there, the idea is that work is not something that you do consciously, but that rather happens sort of despite or independent of your best intentions. So the other examples of these are that he gives, and this is early on, he has this thing called the dream work, right? And the work there is not like labor that you...
Traumarbeit.
Yeah, Traumarbeit, right? It's not, he's not describing the work of interpretation we later do, nor is he describing like anything that you can consciously do. In fact, it's the work you later do interpreting it or anything that you even consciously do while you're asleep, because you're asleep. Rather, that's a series of unconscious processes that are happening while you are yourself sleeping. So analogously, we might think of like, I don't know, Freud is very much speaking about this in the sense of like the way your liver does work. Your liver is going to detoxify booze on its own pace, right? On its own timeline, you know, for better or definitely for worse sometimes. And the other sort of more analogy that keeps occurring to me is the way we use like this word like labor to describe both, well, work in this sense, right? But also in the sense as the job, the thing you do, or as a faction in political life. But also it's labor as in giving birth. It's a biological process that you oftentimes don't control, like the water just breaks. And at that point, I think what all I'm trying to get at here is, and I don't think Freud is entirely clear about this in this essay. And in some ways, that's because he himself has basically spent 15 years being haunted by the death of his father in this text, right? This, which is the thing that, gets him going in 1897, 1896. And then he has to sort of like only peripherally deal with here. And arguably, he only really starts dealing with this after the death of a grandchild. But is this idea that, and I think what he's trying to get at, is that part of what makes grief both cruel and livable for him is the way in which, as he sees it, it operates on temporalities that are other than the volitional, right? So like you could go into work, you can go into psychotherapy for weeks and weeks and weeks, but that isn't necessarily going to cause you to decathect that object, right? It's going to happen on its own. And that way, I think the love analogy is perfectly, because it's like you find someone who you then fall in love and like, well, actually, I can do this again, right? Or suddenly I'm capable of having an encounter that otherwise I would have been incapable of doing.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say one thing, just because I don't think we got into this at the very beginning, is that the piece that we are all talking about is Freud's 1917 essay, Mourning and Melancholia. And I want to also hazard that I think that in some ways, Sarah, it may not have been that useful for you, because I don't think Freud is really interested in mourning in this piece. No, exactly. I think he's really interested in melancholia.
Yeah.
Yes.
And mourning is in some way just a kind of setting. He's sort of like, this is the simple one. This is the easy one.
Right. Which is like, it's not easy at all. But also, well, there are a few things. We'll get to Jacqueline Rose in a little bit, who is like my favorite. But the thing that I found so interesting about it, right? And I think that the thing about work, right, is this question. And like, I did a talk with Guy Standing once, who was very insistent on the difference between work and labor as things. And I was like, yeah, my dude, but you're fighting a losing battle, because most people use them as synonymous, and you're not going to like win that by just like being pedantic about the definitions. You're just not. Like, I'm being pedantic in my own way here, but like I recognize that a lot of these are losing battles. And my gentleman friend who wanted to talk about the physics definition of work is probably, going to win that fight eventually. But the thing that is so interesting, right? And I think we've noted this before, that like in a lot of ways, the thing that Freud describes as mourning is much more suited to like getting dumped than it is to your dad dying, right? Or whatever, right? Or losing your home.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if you lose your home, you probably do eventually sort of like cathect onto a new one. But, you know, one of the people in my immigration chapter, Mohammed Mira, who is from Somalia, right? He still lives in Minneapolis, but his family went back. And his kids are going to school in Mogadishu right now, and his wife, and they're living with their family over there. And he's staying in the US to send money back so he can pay for them to go to school. And, you know, there's like actually like a deep desire in him to be back there. And if not for, you know, ye old capitalism, he would have gone and stayed too. But it turns out that, you know, when we have completely destroyed Somalia as a state, that it's hard to make enough money to support your family nicely. But being an Uber driver in Minneapolis, you can do that. And so, you know, talking to him about that, it's like, great, like the thing is not gone. The desire for the thing is not gone. In the way that like when you get dumped and you know, my book has several references to several different breakups in my life because, you know, I'm 44 and I thought this would all be sorted and it's not. But to think about like, okay, I had planned a future with this person and now that is not going to happen. And now I have to systematically detach from this thing. And on some level, I joke about like sort of exercising different places in my life where I've like been to with somebody and I will like go there with friends or something to like have a good time at like this particular restaurant or bar or park or whatever, so that I'm not just like haunted by an ex when I'm there.
You're deconnecting.
Right. I'm literally consciously doing that.
Yeah.
This way that like, it just seems like a different thing from when like somebody has died. You don't need to, in fact, like go through and let go of everything because they're gone. Like in some ways, like the thing that Freud refers to as reality testing, right? Which is the thing that like Hannah Proctor sort of beautifully takes issue with in her beefing with Freud in Burnout. Reality testing, it's easy. The person's not there. I don't need to like give up all of the, you know, the good memories and the bad memories, frankly, of my father in order to know that he's gone. And in order to have sort of other relationships in my life that are not replacements for that. And I, you know, was thinking about like the difference between somebody who's been widowed, say, going on to date again. I'm thinking of an advice podcast question where somebody had written in who was like, my wife died, I'm dating again. How many pictures I'm like an amateur photographer. I had all these beautiful pictures of my wife. How many of them am I allowed to keep up when I'm bringing home new women? Right. And the difference between that and like, I would, you know, if I was dating somebody whose partner had died, I would not be, it might be a little haunting, but like, I wouldn't be like, you know, oh my God, I can't believe you can't get over this. If he had pictures of his, you know, deceased partner in the house, the same way that I would if he had pictures of like his ex, you know, it would just be like, it's a different thing, right? It's a different relationship to the loss. And that it almost feels like, you know, he's sort of dodging around the issue of like permanent versus impermanent loss. And the sort of mental work you have to do in each one is actually very different.
I think part of what I think is really striking me for as we think about it in these ways, we put these sort of different senses of work alongside one another, is the way in which the paradox, I think, insists precisely in what you were saying about how like, well, this is a thing that should be obvious. Like this person is gone. And yet, you know, like you have the moment where like, oh, I really want to call this person, right? Or I really wish I could, you somehow
win that argument.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of times I've had dreams where like someone who is dead will just be at my bedside and I'll just be like, oh, but they're not there. Right. Or the experiences of taking, actually, I've always stalled in doing this, taking dead people out of my cell phone contacts list, right, is something I just, you know, or encountering the weird ghosty afterlives of people on social media, right? When I'm like, people are posting, you know, on someone on Facebook's wall who's been dead for 15 years, right? These experiences of like, I know, like I can see the Facebook thing. I can see that they haven't posted. I can see that I know that they're dead. And yet some part of me still thinks that they're there. And in a way, what that seems to resemble, it reminds me of what you were just saying about that sort of like the question of, well, when do you know that you're loved? Right? And it takes at a certain point, you'll be like, okay, maybe actually I am, you know, we all have our mileage may vary, our various sort of like hangups, baggage, whatever you want to call it, our traumas may affect when this happens. But ideally, at some point, like, oh, this person actually loves me. I am actually safe here. right? Or you arrive at to give a more sort of banal example, like when does an interpretation from an analyst or a therapist actually land? Like they could say the same thing to you a million different times, but finally at some point it actually, well, to use the Lacanian phrase, it precipitates something. It actually hits. And there it's never really just a question of calendar-based time, right? It's a question of, well, something that's obscured us. Like I for some reason, like I think about like a thing like a million friends have told you, but then suddenly you hear it from someone else who you weren't expecting it from. And maybe it's because of them, but maybe it's because you heard it a million times earlier, but then even suddenly it matters differently. Or like the breakup analogy, I think is another good one. Like I used to like hearing some shitty song, I'd start crying. And then I'm like, oh, actually, no, this, and then, and after enough years, I'm like, wow, actually, this Goo Goo Dolls song just sucks. Right. And now I'm not crying. I'm just like, I'm not thinking about like,
now I'm just embarrassed.
Now I'm just embarrassed at myself. Right. So I guess what that means is that the associations and the sense of what we call possibility is no longer so stuck on this thing. Right. But or rather, it's not just about the negative relation of loss. And so, in other words, like processing the propositional thing, like this person doesn't exist or this relationship is over, happens differently than processing the reality of it psychically. And if anything, it's about the gap between the two of those that makes things so hard. And what I love so much about your work too, and I'm going to read one more quote for it, right, is that ability, which is so singular and really does, I think also, I should say, I wanted to underscore this too, as I was reading your book, I had to go back and double check some research that I came across in my dissertation on parents mourning children, right? Is that actually, apparently people, to the extent to which we want to put our like values in like fMRI stuff, it turns out that parents, and I think it's been extended to some other people, but people who have lost major people in their family actually show a diminished capacity to envision the future in general when it comes to certain types of priming tests. And
yes, I should. Patrick gave me this research and I stuck it in the book in like the last minute. So I was like, oh my God.
It's wild, right? But it makes some sense, even if it's like, not like, what would you do if you had, where are you going? It's not like, I'm like, where are you going with your husband on vacation? And like, oh, my husband's dead. It's like, literally, what would you do if you had $1,000? Some part of you is still like, oh, I want to talk to my husband about what I do with that. Or how do I hide that from my husband? But on some level, your brain is still like your capacity to imagine a future is still oriented, if not around like this pole star, but around a universe that includes this person. And now that when they're gone, well, the things that you want to substitute out, like commodities or other types they don't work. And all this, I really want to build up this read back to you what I thought was one of those beautiful and like psychoanalytically like profound lines in your book, which is, it is here where grief time can teach us something, because grief time is stretched and squeezed, because it is circular and shifting rather than linear. It provides a challenge to straight ahead modes of progress, standardized and clock bound, that capitalism brought to our lives. It requires us to think and move in the rhythms of human vulnerability and limits, to understand that we need other people to cover the gaps when we need a pause, to look out for one another as we step up and step back. And I just got that idea of like it's not because people are replaceable, but like it's because people are so important that when you lose someone who's important, other people, they fill little bits of the thing and they give you new things, but they can never substitute for it.
The way that like, it really does like fuck with your sense of time, right? That like, loss will just affect how you feel about like everything, right? That like our experience of time is subjective. That's not news to anybody who's listening to your podcast probably, but like particularly grief time was such an important thing for me to think about, that like, particularly when COVID hit and we were sort of all living in grief time, right? That we were, sitting there and wondering how people were. And like, I've been friends with the two of you for a while. So like, I knew early on in the pandemic that like Patrick had been very sick, and it was kind of like, how are you doing? I don't know. I don't know what's going on here. I'm like worried. I'm sort of stuck in my space at home going like, how is Patrick doing? How is Ajay doing? How is this other friend who had, early bad COVID, right? Like what's going on here? That like loss of control. And then like, the way that then like when the George Floyd rebellion happened, right? That all of a sudden like the world explodes back into sort of really vivid life in this way, that also felt like time distorting, right? Like like the entire sort of second lockdown, I kind of can't remember other than being on Zoom calls talking about Work Won't Love You Back. But like, I can remember like every day of like street protests in 2020, in like vivid, like I can smell it, when I write about sort of the smoke of the police car on fire. That was just such a like, holy crap moment. Because, it's a police car on fire in the middle of Philadelphia in the middle of the day on like a Saturday, and like the cops kind of can't do anything about it. Was just such a like, oh my God, rupture moment, right? Like nothing is going to go back to the way it was before, except spoiler alert, like everybody keeps trying to tell us that everything has gone back to the way it was before and everything's fine now. And like, no wonder that the world feels completely bonkers, because we all had that experience of sort of stretched and expanded time where everything felt different and everything felt transformed. And now everybody's just like, just go back to work.
Yeah.
That just doesn't work in the same way. And so, I would get calls about like the great resignation or the, quiet quitting or whatever dumb trend people wanted to put on it. And would say like, look, like people died. Like I had an editor ask me about like, why are these industries having this, like nobody wants to work anymore. And I was like, line cooks were the number one for at least a period of the pandemic, most likely to die of COVID. No wonder restaurants can't find workers. You literally killed them. You literally forced people to come into work so that people, jerks like me could get takeaway, and they died. That's why you can't find line cooks, And like this editor was like, oh, but not that many people died. And I was like, a fucking million people died, like so many people died actually. And like this denial that is like, even among sort of nice liberals a lot of the time, that this was that bad. And it's interesting because I was thinking about that at the beginning when you were reading the bit from Freud's essay on transience, right? That like this period of mass death was massively traumatic to everyone in the world. There were parts of the world that were not involved in World War I, where life just went on. There are very few parts in the world that were not touched by COVID. The level of denial that we are now expected to like exist with, it just is occasionally like, what the hell?
Yeah. And it strikes me that that's also part of your resistance to Mourning and Melancholia, because it draws this line between sort of normalcy and pathology. I mean, I think that's not a reading that has to be the case.
No.
And I think it's one that we hear more strongly now, because if you look at the DSM-5, if you grieve, as you say in the book, if you grieve a year, that's fine. A year and a day, well, all of a sudden that tips over into pathology. But I'm not quite done with this essay. And well, none of us will ever be done with this essay, but in particular, I want to think about what you're talking about, Sarah, in terms of the temporality of grief, which is very much thematized in this essay. And I wanted to say that, it's not explicitly in your book, but I felt it there in a lot of ways, because it's dealing with a lot of the same themes, but at a really different political moment, and yet a political moment out of which many of our current disasters have emerged. So Angels in America, the subtitle of which is A Gay Fantasia on National Themes. And, a lot of the time that I might think about it, it might be in the context of thinking about like queer temporality. And there's a figure of whose name is in fact Prior, Walter, like Prior, right? Signaling to us, not subtly, that he is out of time, but it's because he's dying of AIDS. And, it's a play that is very much about the knock-on effects of the Reagan administration. It's very much about the AIDS pandemic. And you get this sense, which I think you also get from Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, here from him thinking in particular about melancholia and the ways in which it makes time out of joint. But so Prior is a kind of prophet, because his mourning, whether it is, and it's some of this is about his positionality as a dying gay man, it allows him to see what others can't see. And I do think that that is a lot of what your book is about, is like the rupture happens the disaster occurs. And I'm thinking here about this line that it actually seems kind of bitchy in Freud. It's like,
there's many bitchy parts in this. Like,
it's
a
true.
lot of this is him wanting to just be like, get over it, you know?
Well, I mean, I actually think so. This is the part where he's talking about melancholics. So, there's a key differentiation, and I won't go into the entirety of it, but here's a nice line. In mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. And, he goes on to describe the melancholic who is doing what I'm going to really deliberately butcher this for a moment by saying we would now call negative self-talk.
Yeah.
So like bombarding oneself with negative self-talk. And Freud, in one of those beautiful Freud kind of like twists, is like, oh wait, but actually he's right. Like, what if actually this is true? And it's and Freud says that he has a keener eye for the truth than other people who are not melancholic. And then he also says, we only wonder why a man has to be ill before he can be accessible to a truth of this kind. And while I don't think we have to narrowly take it in the context in which Freud is writing about, sort of like the truth of the melancholic self, which is an incredibly self-punitive one, I think there's something that's really resonant with your book here, which is about the ways in which grief, it's almost a kind of standpoint theory, in a sense, in which grief allows you to see differently and in some ways better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bit about the melancholic is really interesting because, like, having been fairly depressed fairly recently, it turns out locking yourself in a audiobook studio to read your book about grief, which is about the worst 6 years of your life out loud, will do that to you. I am always struck by the fact that, like, the things that I will tell myself when I am depressive versus the things that I will tell myself when I am whatever are not different, but like, it is really hard, actually, as someone who writes about depressing shit for a living, to also sometimes imagine futures that don't suck for like myself personally, right? Because I will sit there and I'll be like, I feel awful about this thing. This person broke up with me. My dad died. Also, I have it pretty friggin' good. And, and it's this, people will often like attempt to sort of reassure me and be like, da, 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 whatever. And I'm like, yeah. But like, actually the world is shit. And actually, there are like 30,000 children buried under rubble in Gaza right now. So like, actually, it doesn't have to get better at all. And like, that's true. That's a fact, right? Like, it is a fact that I could walk out this door and get hit by a bus right now. I'm in London, so I'm probably not likely to get shot at least. But like, all of these things can be true. When people are like, oh, don't worry, you'll find somebody or something like that. It's like, you don't know that. You don't know that at all. And it's that like that sort of relentlessly like, no, this is true. That is so sort of cruel about depression, right? That is like, and it's reality testing in sort of the cruelest way you could possibly be to yourself, But you will sit there and you'll be like, yeah, this is, you can't tell me that this will get better because XYZ horrible thing have happened, right? And not only like, I have been broken up with, which is clearly the most signal tragedy that ever happened in the world. But like, again, how many people have died in Gaza right now? How many people are dying right now? And, Israelis are debating whether it's okay to rape political prisoners. And like, I'm like, I live in a world where that happens and you want me to like be positive about anything? Like, no, that's hard. Spent a lot of this year basically feeling like that. I was like, this world is so shit. And to try to pull out of that without a sort of, I hate that phrase toxic positivity, but it's a thing that people use a lot. And I don't know if there's a more appropriately psychoanalytic way to talk about that maybe you guys can tell me. That like to sort of insist upon hope in some context just feels cruel.
Yeah.
Feels unnecessary and it is unhelpful. And like, I assume that any clinician who is treating somebody who is depressive is not going to just be like, but it'll get better. That's just not how you would do that because it's not going to work. And that sort of the relentless cruelty of like the truth in that, right?
Mm-hmm. Is the reality principle is a cruel one.
Exactly. And so that sense of like, yeah, like I think it's really interesting because again, like I the whole gloss on it is sort of somebody who has like, again, I just can't sort of say it any other way than like gotten dumped. And therefore it's just like obsessively like excoriating for having lost this. And like, I watch people I know go through this. I watch myself go through this and go like, oh, but like, what would be the healthy way to deal with this? Right. What is even the ordinary unhappiness of dealing with this? Right. Like, when the world sort of dishes out like extraordinarily brutal and cruel treatment, like constantly, like that is ordinary. That is the sort of ordinary unhappiness of life right now. And how do we then like try to pick ourselves up off the ground and imagine like changing it, and on my good days, I think there's no other way to get through life other than fighting to change it and connecting with other people who fight to change it. And that is the only thing that like gives me meaning. And like, Hannah Proctor ends her book with this line from Mike Davis. It was like, fight with hope, fight without hope, but fight absolutely. And she and I sort of shared this understanding of like, I want to write this book. This book is going to be dark. I don't want to say give up. I want to say the opposite of give up, but I don't want to sort of give people this like, everything's fine now, guys, or just a few tweaks and everything will be fine. Like, the reason that revolution is in the subtitle of my book is like, we really need to overhaul absolutely everything and in a rather short time period because, the planet's on fire as we sit here sweating in our, respective non-air conditioned apartments. And, to sort of get to that, I think we have to go through the grief for it. And we have to go through the real sort of horror of it in order to get to that place where you fight, whether or not with hope,
Well, it seems to me that to the extent that you dally with hope at all, it is in the Mariam Kaba, hope is a discipline way of thinking about it, which is not an affect, right?
No,
it's an orientation.
It's an orientation. It's a process. It's to go back to Ashan on imagining otherwise, that like, there's a period in sort of deep grief where you can't imagine anything, right? It's just gone. And then you start to be able to see it. And it's not that it's over. And this is like my beef with Freud is not that like whatever, but it's not that it's ended, therefore. And maybe it is a different phase of it, except these things go sort of in and out and in, grief time. But when you start to be able to imagine otherwise, it's in part because you sort of have to live through, to reverse the Mark Fisherism or the Frederick Jamesonism or whatever. Once you have imagined the end of the world, it's much easier to imagine the end of capitalism. And once you have sort of seen the end of your world and, to be very Jewish about it, right? The idea that the end of a life is the end of a whole world. Okay, what if this was totally different? And that like, the ability to sort of see forward, which is true of grief and depression, and that the symptoms, to go back to Freud, but also to go back to the DSM, right, are fairly similar. And the difference being that like grief is usually got something you can point to that is a reason why somebody feels like there is no future and they can't get out of bed or whatever your particularly depressive symptoms might be. And this idea that like we can, that in order to hope, in order to organize, in order to think politically at all, we have to be able to imagine things. And that the lack of that is really, that's really difficult. It's really hard. I read this lovely book. All I do in these interviews is recommend other people's books.
That's great. That's all we do also is tell people to read books.
Short story anthology. It was called Palestine Plus 100. And it is a series of science fiction stories by Palestinian writers about Palestine in the future. And some of them are horrific and some of them are not. But it was a really fascinating thing. This had already been written and put out in the world before the latest, horror show that we've been living with for almost a year now. But it was really striking to just sort of sit with and be like, right, like people who are coming from like some of the worst I can think of, are still writing a future and saying there are Palestinians in the future, right? That there is Palestine in the future. I have on my stack in front of me Everything for Everyone by Emmy O'Brien and Iman. And I met Iman this summer and she's so fantastic. And she was talking about the chapter in that book, which I haven't finished reading yet, where, she talks about the freeing of Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and again, she wrote that before this most recent set of whatevers, but I heard her give a talk about it in this, a month ago. And to be able to imagine that in this moment feels both like impossible to me and like the only thing that matters. So the reason that I was so struck by this Jacqueline Rose essay, which again is something that I discovered by reading Hannah Proctor's book. So thank you, Hannah.
Which, by the way, Sarah asked us to read for today. I should say.
I gave her homework. Well, mostly first I was like, Abby, do you have access to this? Because I don't have academic library access. And B, can we also talk about it? So it's called Virginia Woolf and the Death of Modernism, but it begins with Freud. And she starts by writing, there is a strange moment on the first page of Mourning and Melancholia, where Freud mentions, almost in passing, that mourning can be sparked not only by the loss of a loved one, but equally by some abstraction, such as one's country, liberty, and ideal. Since Freud is writing in 1915, it seems clear, as the papers on war from the same year will confirm, that what he is alluding to is the loss of belief in the redeeming power of Western civilization precipitated by the carnage of the war. So when Freud goes on to insist that mourning is something to be worked at, completed, got over, already strange for a psychoanalysis which maintains that nothing ever goes away, I think it is fair to assume that a drive for political or cultural as much as psychic self-protection is at stake. And a little bit later, she writes, if you are not seeking to preserve the abstraction of civilization, insert ellipses here, then mourning shifts her colors and her terms, which I just think, I'm obsessed with Jacqueline Rose. I love her. She turns up in my book a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly, I binge read her 2 books on Zionism very quickly in November while I was trying to figure out how the hell to write about a genocide in a book I had already basically finished. Like I turned in a draft of this book September 15th, and then this happened. So I had to, as noted before, tear a chunk out of my first chapter and write 5,000 words about Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
But I find like the fact that she is sort of challenging Freud on mourning as saying this is like Freud not being psychoanalytic enough, that his sort of insistence on the cleanness of it is in fact political, right? That, what is it? To put it simply, mourning must come to an end so that we can believe in ourselves once more. And she means believe in ourselves as like Western civilization, right? Which Freud is still more or less invested in as a concept, which by the end of my book, I am like, maybe it was a mistake. I start out in the Palestine chapter being like, the modern nation state was a mistake. Israel was definitely a mistake. But also by the end of it, I'm just like, what if, this whole Enlightenment thing also bad, which is, a bit of an exaggeration, but not really. And this question of like, can we actually think like mourning politically, right? Which is a thing that she's asking in this piece. And she's also asking it through the work of Virginia Woolf and through 2 Virginia Woolf works that I have not actually read. So I have no deep thoughts about them other than that I should probably read them now. This idea that like making mourning into a concept that ends is an attempt to sort of psychically deal with the wounds of World War I, which, again, makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about being told to go back to normal after COVID. And that the another person that I have random beef with, Adam Tooze, on some podcast was saying like, what's going on right now can't be fascism because there's been no period of like mass death like World War I. And I was like, did you miss the pandemic, sir? We have had a huge period of mass death. I don't know where you live, but I assume it is in the world that has an internet connection. That we are deeply, deeply sort of affected by these moments. And again, that like the grief cannot be sort of forced to end neatly so that we can all get back to wage labor, in the 3 days or something you might get for grieving leave, right? If you get it at all, right? Like bereavement leave is something that is deeply fought over. So yeah, so I don't know if you guys loved this piece as much as I did, or if I am the number one Jacqueline Rose fan over here.
I want to pull out one piece from Sarah's book
Mm.
just to throw that in the mix here. So Sarah says, I was haunted by a piece written by Polly Smythe, who worked in a shop during the pre-vaccine days. When I handed a customer his change through the small hole in the plexiglass divider, he reached out, took my hand, and clung to it. After about 10 seconds, he let go, looked down at the floor, and said, I'm very sorry. The thing is, I live alone.
Yeah, because I related so much to that guy. An interesting side note, the bodega that I ran to before we did this interview to get my little CBD drinks, the guy who owns it always, like, whenever he sees me, he stops and like takes my hand. How are you today? How are you today? So I always think of that in reverse, because he's, of course, the worker at the place who's like insistent on the contact. He's so lovely. I like him so much. But that moment of like, yeah, imagine being that person. Like I was that person for a while. I was living in a doorman building and I would go down to get the mail and I would stand sort of masked and 10 feet away from the doorman and just be like, please talk to me, sir. Those deep moments of loneliness.
Yeah.
Like we are not meant to be cut off from other creatures, right? Humans are like, we like biologically need co-regulation. Like this is this cool modern neuroscience, right? But like to be that alone and then to be told that like it doesn't matter, even if no one we know and love died, just like not true for me. It's not true for, most people I know, like most people know somebody. But even if, no one died, you still went through like this, nightmare. And we still had no idea how it was going to go in the early days. And to pretend that that's not like just a huge scar that like has like all of these potential sort of awful ramifications. I get into fascism, not that deep in this book, but at the end, I'm like, look, like this is like the options we have are this sort of gleeful celebration of the death of other people, or we actually fight for the value of human life, which like sounds kind of corny when you say it. I had some friends the other day who were like, oh, I just like, I'm too much of a materialist to like think about emotions. And I was like, well, mate, like, why are we communists then?
I'm so struck by like the question of relationality, or right, the way in which like feeling alone is feeling that you don't have people that you can relate to, or that relations are somehow blocked. And in that way, the COVID situation and sort of the world that COVID exposes, and both exposes and makes anew in some ways, right? Because I think as you yourself argue, like it really ratifies the hierarchy of sort of like disposable jobs, and like people whose jobs are more or less treated, are already hyper exposed to various types of workplace injury, to addiction, to other such things, right? It really ratifies those as also being places where you can get COVID too, right? What I take to be so crucial in the Rose piece, and also what I take to be so crucial in the Freud essay, which is itself, very complicated and could be read as him litigating a great many things and having a lot of conversations with different people, is this idea that there is a state that you can get to, which, he calls melancholia, but we might call like really severe depression, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like major depressive disorder type stuff, where you are radically, well, he uses the word impoverished in some ways, right? But also like stuck, both temporally and physically, but also like in terms of your imaginative capacity. And that may have like the certain like correctness of depressive realism when it comes to like, I don't know how they test for that. It's like games of chance and game theory stuff, right? You may be better capable of assessing your odds, but you're some basic part of you, I guess what Marx might even call like your capacity for species being, right, has been damaged and is going unfulfilled. And he, in a way, when he's talking about like some of the deepest experiences of these people that he calls, those in the grips of melancholy, that squares with my own experience of like, like the really serious depressive episodes are the ones where you're like, you don't just, some part of you knows that you want to go out and be with people, and you should go out and be with people, and people tell you that's how you get better, but also you don't want that. And, you're like, why would people want, I don't want to be around people. But then there comes a point, and this is the point where I've been like, okay, now serious treatment and an actual intervention like really needs to happen, is the point where you think yourself into a place, and I'm just speaking for myself here, where you're like, oh, it's not that I don't want to be with people and know that it would be better if I were with people, right? It's that literally, in a way that seems totally lucid, you're like, actually, my being around people would be bad for them, right? It would be better for me and for them if I didn't exist. In fact, that's the telos is like a really grim kind of like the logic of like eliminating yourself, but not even to deal with your own pain, right? Though that's there, but because you sort of put yourself into a position where you're actually causing more pain to other people by continuing to exist. And that's like a terrifying and scary place to be. And yet also, and when that happens, if anyone's listening to this and is at that point, you got to get help. Like that's an incorrect thought, right? I promise. Just like categorically, like that's not the case. It's so striking how that's also like, well, you bring in Thatcher, right? And these ideas of like how a society where there's nothing but families, or not even families, it's just the individual, right? This idea that, well, no relations are possible. You can actually become a total drain on like the economic order, like, or you're just a parasite, or you've been deprecated, made redundant, whatever. Yeah, it literally it presents as a depressive, like, and I could say like we might even call it like it's in that area where when you start having those thoughts that you're entering into a space of like almost like depressive psychosis, right? Where you're like you just become convinced that you are the thing that's wrong with the world.
Yeah,
that's normative.
There's so much there that it is in some ways what sort of capitalism wants us to think, right? That like the hyper individualism, right, is so, as you say, so intensely sort of driven into you that like even me, right, and I sort of politically believe all these things that I've been saying, and I have the hardest time asking for anything that I need. I take care of 98% of my needs by myself. I live alone. I pay my bills. I do all of these things alone. And I have the worst time asking for anything. And that's on a normal day. That's when I'm doing great, When I'm actually hurting, it is next to impossible. And if I manage to do it and somebody's response is sort of not perfect, then it just triples down on all of these things that are like deeply, deeply embedded within my, emotional libertarian psyche, right? And my father, I was just listening to Esther Perel this morning because I was having this conversation with Craig, who I do the podcast with.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and dug back up this episode at the end of the first season of How's Work, which has now disappeared off the internet for the most part, which is really sad because the podcast was great. Where she does this interview with Adam Grant, who's like an occupational psychologist or something that I don't really understand. And I found it on his page, actually. And she talks about like, were you raised for autonomy or were you raised for, I think, connection?
Right.
And that like that intense autonomy of it, right? That like turns just like pathological, right? And like Freud is getting at that with melancholia, right? That like you are excoriating yourself for having lost the love object. And therefore you are unworthy of ever being loved again. And so on and so on and so on. And I'm actually going back to the Jacqueline Rose because this bit, one of the things that she does again is trouble this sort of distinction between mourning and melancholia, right? And she writes, what does it mean, for example, to say that in mourning, in contradistinction to melancholia, there is nothing about the loss that was unconscious? Couldn't one instead say, paraphrasing Freud on the hysteric, that the one who grieves knows and does not know at the same time? Or we might ask, what is this love that in mourning, as opposed to melancholia, steadfastly, dedicatedly works to extinguish itself? Again, we could turn back onto Freud, his famous observation that no subject can envisage his or her own death. Love would not be love if it were able to contemplate, let alone work to bring about its own end. And I just like, I love that, right? Because it's like, right, this idea that we should like coolly and calmly be able to sort of detach from something that we have lost in order to move on into the world is like, it's so capitalist realist, right?
Yeah. No, it
It is
is.
people are fungible. It is we don't need anybody. It is the Margaret Thatcher unit. It is just like move on to things. And she just insists in this, sort of beautiful way, and then draws on these wonderful Virginia Woolf pieces to say, like, no, that's just not how it works.
It is a beautiful essay. I don't think I agree with it, but I think it's a beautiful essay. And one part of it that I want to just kind of make sure we get out on the table is really early on when she, and I think Sarah, you would agree with this as far as I can tell about your reading of Freud. She sees this essay, and she's reading Freud Freudianly, right? She's reading him symptomatically, and she says that the essay is an attempt to drive mourning away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And another word for that is repression.
Right.
She doesn't say that. That's me editorializing. And, I think it is a beautiful essay by Rose, and I love Jacqueline Rose. I just think that Mourning and Melancholia is not about mourning. That's having revisited it recently. I think that the title is a red herring. I think it is a theory of melancholia that happens to take mourning as its jumping off point and is using a certain, as you said, very restricted and restrictive conception of mourning heuristically in order to get into what I think is, actually like a very astute and at times quite moving theory of / dramatization of both like the phenomenological experience of the one who is melancholic and also of the encounter, whether as a clinician or as just a person encountering someone else in the world, that sort of phenomenological experience of what is it like to be near someone who is existing in that state of melancholy. And here's maybe where I get a little more on board with Rose, because that latter phenomenological experience, like those two things might be indistinguishable.
Yeah, I just think it is a very specific, again, if we are glossing melancholia as something that we would now describe as depression, like the worst parts of depression, like this summer has been rough. Last winter was rough, but it was, at least I knew why. And so it was like, I am not completely in this thing because there is a reason. Whereas when it just comes and takes you, when you're like, everything's actually fine, that depression is its most terrifying, right? When you're just like, actually, like nothing has happened to make this happen. It's just there. As opposed to like, again, like, my therapist that I was working with at the time, and also all the therapists that I spoke to for this book, are like, grief is not a pathology, right? Even though it has the same symptoms as depression, because you fundamentally know what it's about. And in this in taking a loss as a jumping off point for explaining melancholia, right? You are still describing something that, like, on some level makes sense, right? Whereas like the most terrifying part of deep depression can just be like, there's no reason. It's just there. And suddenly I feel like the world would be better off without me.
And this is the flip side to that also seems to be, and here again, I'm just speaking from personal experience, the way in which when a depression lifts, it just does. Like, I know you're suddenly like, wow, I stop waking up, and for some reason I don't feel like, insert extremely morbid thought here, right? Just for some, and there's that brief lag time where you're like, oh, maybe this is itself part of the cruelty of it, right? Or like, what the fuck why couldn't I get out of bed? It's not just like the meds are working or something. It's like literally something sort of shifts. And again, I think this is when we're talking about timelines that are not those of capitalism.
Right.
Timelines and like a lack of control. And this is where I sort of return to the work thing. So to be myself, and it's actually been very interesting because I am seeing a somatic experiencing therapist these days, partly because I was like, I have talked all of my issues to death. I'm not a repressed Victorian woman who can't tell you what the hell like traumatized me. Like I know, but it's not gone. Because it's in here.
Right.
And it's actually really interesting to sort of return to Freud on hysteria and like the sort of somatic symptoms of hysteria, right? While thinking about like all of sort of modern trauma research. And Abby knows because I messaged her as soon as I read it. I finally read Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, and we could do a whole other hour on this stuff. But like,
I'm happy you read it, but also I'm sorry because it's such a painful book.
It is, but it was really helpful, which is depressing to say. But like to think about how these things are in the body.
Yes.
Depression, trauma, PTSD, right? CPTSD, whatever we're using as the descriptor, like they are physical. And so to sort of get out of the mind-body split, which again, this is something that I write about in this book, the sort of Enlightenment dualism that like created, you know, the possibility of just destroying the fucking planet. It also has like limited our ability to deal with our own psyches because we literally think that if we just think it through, we'll figure it out and we'll have some sort of revelation in your brain. And then that will like make the depression go away. And like, sadly, it doesn't work like that. And the challenge of like, you know, today, again, that like, if we're thinking about psychoanalysis historically, you know, I remember I had this conversation with Josh Cohen when I was working on the book and I was interviewing him and I was like, so like, it's really fascinating to think about the castration anxiety because I'm like, did people really run around telling their kids that they would cut off their wee-wee if they, you know, played with it? Like, is that like a common thing at some point in Victorian England? Because like, I don't know if that's a common thing now. And are we sort of making an entire theory based on a specific set of historical practices? Like, we talk about sex now. We talk about desire. We talk about trauma now in public and sort of oversharing on podcasts like I'm doing right now. And that moment of sort of revelatory, like, I know what happened to me and now symptoms have gone. Like, it doesn't seem to work the same way when we've been talking about it for, 10 years in my case or whatever it is. Right. And so it's like, we have to sort of go one click further and be like, where is it in the body? Mm-hmm. And to understand that, you have to let go of this idea of like the brain having supreme control and the conscious mind having supreme control and get back in a lot of ways to the unconscious and the physical.
Sarah, when is the book out? When are your upcoming book events? Talk to us about where our listeners can see and or hear and or read more Sarah Jaffe.
So the book is out September 10th in the US. It'll be out October 10th in Britain and Ireland. And it is, you can get it at your local bookstore. I encourage you to pre-order it from your local bookstore because that means they'll buy it. You can also get it on the internet. So there will be a pre-order code in the show notes for getting 20% off of the book if you pre-order it through Hachette's website. You can, again, order it from the Hell site or any place else in the world that you want. I will be in Chicago for the book launch. I will also be at the Printers Row Literary Festival the weekend before and the Socialism Conference the weekend before that. So Labor Day weekend, if you were hearing this before all of that. We will be doing an event on Pub Day, September 10th at the Haymarket House in Chicago, which I'm very excited about. I will be in Minneapolis on October 1st, I believe. And I will be back in London to launch her in London in early October. And that is all that I know details-wise so far. I will be on this podcast. I will be on other podcasts. If you would like me to come on your podcast, you can get in touch with me.
Sarah, thank you so much for being here. It was, as always, such a pleasure to get to talk and think with you.
And congratulations on the book. It really is excellent.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me talk about my therapy.
Ordinary Unhappiness is supported completely by our Patreon community. So if you enjoyed this episode and you would like to get 2 more Patreon paywalled episodes per month, come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Sarah Jaffe. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.